Hello, my name is Mike Lurie with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm the Director of Media Relations here at the university. I'm with Professor Carlo DiClemente from the Psychology Department here at UMBC. How are you, sir?
Good. Thanks, Mike.
It's great to have you here. We're going to talk a bit about your research, a couple of books to which your name is prominently attached that I'll hold up for the camera. Changing for Good, which is more of a kind of layman's, I think, how-to manual for changing addictive behaviors. And then Addiction and Change, which I believe gets into more of practical and precise methods in this research. Why don't you talk about, Carlo, what got you interested in addictive behaviors as you completed your PhD at the University of Rhode Island?
Sure. Actually, I didn't start out with an interest in addictive behaviors. I really have an interest in psychotherapy and behavior change. And so I was trying to kind of figure out how to look at issues of how do people change and trying to kind of figure that out. There are lots of different systems of therapy out there. There are lots of ways that people do psychotherapy. At one point, there are 250 different therapies. And yet, if you put them together, most of the time, you will get similar outcomes. And so what we were trying to do was figure out, well, if you can get similar outcomes from different treatments, maybe you really need to look at the individual who's making the change and figure out how that particular person or how these people change their behaviors. And so my research and my dissertation started looking at smokers, actually, trying to kind of figure out how they change. And so I did some initial work looking at the process of change and did some follow-up of people who were successful and tried to kind of figure out where they were. When you actually try to look at how people change, you can't just ask what they did, you have to ask when they did it. And so we came up with this model that kind of looked at the stages of change as well as kind of the processes of change. And that was the beginning of what we have called the trans-theoretical model. That's really the foundation of the two books that you have.
I was going to go there next. The trans-theoretical model or the trans-theoretical approach is really becoming linked to your name and your research. I'm not sure how much it's involved in your teaching of students here at UMBC, but can you talk, let's pretend it was visitation day before, say, even a 5th grade class.
Okay.
And you were telling folks what you do, or about that model. In layman's terms, can you elaborate?
Sure, I can try. I mean, when I was talking, there's a whole lot of different theories about how people change. And so what this model tries to do is actually bring together some of the basic principles of a variety of theories. So it's really what they call a collected or an eclectic theory of kind of a model that brings together different perspectives and tries to integrate them around the idea that change happens over time, that there are different parts of the process that are important, and that many of the processes that are identified by many theories of therapy are ones that people can use in their daily life as well as people use in treatment. So that was another piece that really was critical, was finding out that the same principles apply whether you're changing on your own or whether you're going into treatment.
Because it seems to me in reading through both books that as people try to change behaviors, the most intensively destructive, substance abuse, or just down to a person who's trying to lose 20 pounds and finds him or herself frustrated, that society tends to brand or label a person who is not succeeding as having a lack of willpower. And if I'm reading your research correctly, that becomes problematic in itself.
Yeah, I think just to kind of say willpower, because I think, the issue is most of us have been successful in making some changes and unsuccessful in making others. So if it's really willpower and it's a personal characteristic, then how do you attribute the successes that you've actually had? So I think what you have to do is really step back and say, wait a minute now, I am successful in some areas. What contributes to success and what contributes to failure? And that's the personal process that I think people have to go through. in order to kind of do that. And there's lots of elements of why you're not successful in this area of losing 20 pounds, and you might be successful in quitting smoking.
Right, something that leapt out to me, it's such a common issue, the person who's trying to lose that 5 or 10 or 30 pounds. And I believe in the second book, kind of the more clinical or scientific book, Addiction and Change, you point out, forgive me, I think it's the other one, but the first book, Changing for Good, you point out that the person who's branded as lacking willpower might not know that he or she has slowed down the metabolism by eating less, and that's it's pun intended, it's sort of feeding on itself, all of the frustration. And so if a person can be educated about why their changes aren't working, whether it's an approach to quitting drinking, an approach to quitting smoking or losing weight, that they can perhaps be tailored and monitored better.
Yeah, that's the wonderful thing about actually working with addictions. I mean, the model has been used in lots of different behaviors for prevention as well as treatment. But the interesting thing about addictions are there's all of these, the physiological, it goes from the physiological to the social dimensions, and it incorporates all of those different dimensions. And again, to try and understand how those all operate, it's best if you understand that within this process of change. So that, yes, there are physiological things that might be helpful or harmful. For alcohol, for example, we know that some groups of people, many Asians have a physiological reaction to alcohol that's protective, that actually stops them from moving through this process and becoming more addicted. Now you could still overcome that, but it's a little bit harder. So the biology fits in and underlies the process, but there's also you can fight your biology, as most of us do at various points in time, and that's depending on how committed you are and how much you do of the other pieces of the change process.
Is there anything in your work over the course of 20 years, specifically with alcohol abuse? And as an outpatient counselor, you've been consulted by many private and public organizations in this region, that has leapt out to you that either you really take home at the end of the day about the specific addiction of alcohol, or that applies across all of these challenges with addictive behaviors?
Well, with all of these, I think you have to kind of figure that the individual has to come. I mean, we have these steps, and the stages are really steps, and they really represent some tasks that people need to accomplish in order to make a change. So we talk about a stage called pre-contemplation, where people just aren't thinking about changing. Well, if you're going to move from there, you need to increase people's interest and concern about the problem. So a lot of people will push aside concerns. No, I'm drinking like everyone else, or no, I'm fine. Well, every once in a while I drink a little bit too much, but I'm really fine. There's not a big problem here. As long as you don't see the problem or have any concern about the problem, it's hard for you to kind of go to the next step, which is really making a risk-reward analysis and saying, do I really need to change this? I mean, what's the pros, what's the cons, what's the pros of staying, what's the pros of changing, and doing that so that you come up with a firm decision. And a lot of times if that firm decision isn't there, then you can't move on to the next step, which is really making a commitment and planning to do the change. So what's interesting is I don't think there's one answer to your question. I think that it's a really good question, but people get tripped up all along the way on the path of this journey through change, and they can get tripped up at different points in time.
I was taking some notes. I think this was from Addiction and Change, the more precise book, to use your language, and I kind of wrote a flow chart where different factors lead to the addiction, but what you found with your colleagues in your research is that the recovery follows a somewhat common path, across individuals, across addictive behaviors. Can you expand on that?
Right. Well, that's what I was just talking about some, is that there is this path. And if you think about the pathway, the journey, if we talk about it, it's a similar journey of change for smokers, for drinkers, for all these individuals. You have to move through these tasks. You have to kind of move on, finish one of those, and do the next. I mean, when I'm giving talks these days, I kind of talk to people about if I wanted you to, do you have an iPhone?
I personally do not.
Good.
One day
So if I
coming
wanted to
soon.
convince you to kind of get an iPhone, which would be a big change,
Right.
I'd have to do the same kinds of tasks. I'd have to get you interested and concerned, have you make a decisional balance that said, yes, the iPhone is for me, my old phone isn't any good now anymore, I really need one of these. I'd have to get you to figure out how to get it and plan it and change if you're Verizon, you have to go to AT&T.
Right.
I'd have to get you to kind of go through and do it, and then I'd have to teach you how to learn how
Does
to
a
do
person
it.
want to get invested in all of these?
And get in there. Yeah.
Right, and all these steps.
So the same change process seems to underlie all of these kinds of behaviors, and that's really the kind of foundation of what we found and why it's kind of across theories.
Right. You've written also about the tricky notion of punishment, that so often in our society, punishment is the first response, so to speak, to the person having that serious substance issue. How problematic is that? Because I think it reflects a not very enlightened view of how our systems go about treating people.
It's a very good question, Mike. Punishment, as we've found it in psychological, it just suppresses behavior. So you can suppress a behavior without changing it. So I've had people come to me and say, I'm going to stop drinking. Why? Well, I'm on probation for the next 3 months. So they don't want the punishment, and they're going to avoid that by not drinking for the next 3 months, but they're not going to quit. At the end of those 3 months, they're going to go back to drinking. The same with drug abusers, the same with, we do a lot of research, we've done research with pregnant women who they're going to stop smoking during the pregnancy. They're not really quitting because they go back to smoking right after the baby's born, the majority of them. So we can't, what punishment does and what we call it is kind of more of an extrinsic motivation. If you put extrinsic motivation in there, extrinsic motivation can stop you from doing behavior, but it doesn't necessarily help you. It can help you, but it doesn't necessarily help you to make it a change rather than just a suspension of the behavior.
So it's a notion of things coming from within. It
Right.
sounds very, very much so. What in recent years, what has the give and take been like with you and UMBC students? Is the outlook of an 18 to 22-year-old undergraduate, say, as we have about 9,200 undergraduates at UMBC, is that student's perspective about these issues different here in 2009 than, say, in 1999?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that it's really perceptions of what's problematic changes dramatically over time. Because some things that are in at one point in time, I grew up in the 60s where you had, and 70s where kind of, there's lots more of different kind of drugs that people thought, well, that was cool to use. Alcohol kind of comes in and out. Certain kind of drugs come in and out. What's interesting is I think there's lots more study drugs these days that people are using and they don't see as much of a problem with them, but they can be problematic as well. So
in
terms
said about,
of,
for instance, the drugs used to treat attention deficit disorder, I think that some students have used to just keep themselves awake at night who don't have an issue.
Right. Well, and actually, the biggest drug abuse problem in the United States is really non-prescription use of prescription medications. It's really not cocaine and heroin.
Right.
So, so I think that the kind of problems that you see change over time and the perspectives change over time among the students. I mean, I think currently students see smoking as much less attractive than 5 or 10 years ago. So the problem perception. I think the process perception, I'm not sure how that changes. It's interesting. I mean, I teach some upper level undergraduate courses in addictions, and the students that I've seen have really enjoyed kind of being in the class and learning about the process and seeing how that process can work across a number of different areas for themselves.
Right. So with the trans-theoretical model as such a backbone of the research you've done through the years, what's ahead for you? Do you think, is there a research endeavor in the coming year or two that you're especially excited about?
Yes, actually. We're doing a couple of things that are really, really interesting. We're actually trying to identify processes of change or kind of how people change in a project that we have funded by the National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And we're getting people to kind of call us twice a week who are in treatment for drinking and trying to kind of identify what are the key elements of commitment and decision making and some of the things that I've just talked about.
Right.
How do those elements play in the process of kind of making changes in your drinking? So this mechanisms of change kind of research is something that I'm very interested in doing. We're also kind of, I'm also interested in bringing change actually into the community. So I actually run a group here called the Center for Community Collaboration in the Psychology Department. And we're going out and really trying to empower community agencies funded by the AIDS Administration and also funded by DHMH in the smoking area to kind of go out and help the folks who are actually working with people to help them change, to teach them skills, motivational skills, and helping them to do that. So I've been very interested in dissemination. How do you actually disseminate good practice and best practices out in the community? And then we're also just kind of looking at, I was telling you about the stimulus projects that we're looking at. Right. There's one that's actually looking to try and get an fMRI machine to kind of, at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center that we would collaborate with, so UMBC and MPRC.
Discuss what an fMRI machine is.
It's a machine that actually looks at the brain and kind of can look at the brain functioning and lights up as different parts of the brain light up. So we're looking to try and see if we can translate the mechanisms of change research and look at it from a brain perspective as well.
I think in the time we have left, I'd wanted to ask you about something you mentioned in a private conversation recently, a very interesting theory that I believe you've done some research into, as much as the country's financial crisis has been in the news and the banking crisis, and research that you've done showing that, you know, these masters of the universe, as the Bonfire of the Vanities describe these titans in the financial and Wall Street world, really have a gambling addiction, that there were these billion-dollar losses at these financial institutions brought about by people who love to be on the cutting edge and are sort of risk junkies. It's fascinating to me. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I think what I saw in terms of what's happening in the financial markets is very similar to a gambling addiction. I mean, in gambling addiction, you have machines and you have games and you have other kinds of things. Many of the financial products really had no inherent value. They were kind of risk. You know, you lay your money down, you bet whether it's going up or you bet whether it's going down. And you do some of those kind of things. And it seems to me that where we got into trouble was people kind of got addicted to the risk and the risk taking, which is very heady, because if you see it going up, I mean, when you see those bells going off in the casinos and things going up and the numbers kind of going and you just want a big pot, it really changes. I mean, there is a neurochemical change. And so
something like an endorphin, but
it is.
Right,
it's very similar to that. I mean, they've actually done the neurology and kind of looked at the brain functioning and saw that in gambling you actually see some similar things as you see with substances. So I think that what's happened in that group is that they've become very addicted to the highs of that win. And one of the big things that you can identify in addiction, gambling addiction, is people chasing the loss. So
trying to make up for
the losses by kind of going and
grounds.
betting more, or going and back and betting some more, and you're going to do that. Or maybe I should make a bigger bet now because I lost on that one. And so that's part of what I think, what I've been reading actually in the paper is that's what you've seen, is that people have kind of chased the losses with kind of doing bigger and bigger bets. And that's why some of these are massive losses. And so recovery would require these individuals to kind of really kind of understand the gambling addiction and then kind of change the value system as well as the behavior that supports this. Otherwise, I don't think we get a we don't get the change. You don't get real change. You get somebody who may stop that because now they're being punished and all of that, but it will pop up again and they'll do it again. And maybe we try to do it with regulation, but I'd really like to see the people change.
Yeah, I mean, regulation was going to be the next question. I realize you're not an economist, but it seems that the people with these personalities were put in a place where the regulation really is lacking, whether it's, futures or different, commodities or derivatives or these complex products that are hard for all of us to understand, and there was just more leeway.
Well, I think that's true, but I think it's also true that what you really see is they sought areas that were unregulated and created areas that were unregulated. So if you see a gambler, that's what they will do. I mean, if they can't find the casino or they're banned from this casino, then you have internet gambling, or you go over here and do some other kind of thing. So if you're really driven to do this, you will find venues where you can do it, or people end up betting on just about anything because of the addiction and because of that sense that, I'm going to get this high back.
Tell me if I'm right about this theory about your work. Would it be accurate to say that it's been both uplifting and you've seen a lot of tragedy? In other words, on the tragic side, lives that could be fine, that could be so complete, were it not for addiction X, whatever that addiction is, and how gratifying it is when you've seen people overcome it.
No, I think that watching people to change, I mean, the best kind of endorsement of the theory is from individuals who have actually kind of gone through it, and when they hear it kind of say, gee, that really helps me to understand where I've been and how I've made the changes. So that part is really kind of very gratifying. But these are problems that cause great devastation among families and among individuals, and so yes, you have to be willing to kind of go in and look at the devastation in order to kind of look for the hope. Because I think the other thing I believe is that every one of these individuals can change. And so that's the challenge, is kind of helping them to learn how they can do it.
Right.
And how they can do it before there's so much damage or there's so much destruction or death.
And really concentrating on each stage of their particular recovery process, where it's almost like DNA, I guess. It has to be tailored to that individual person and their circumstances.
Well, and they have to do it properly from their perspective. I mean, it's got to be your decision. So you have to kind of find the value system inside you to kind of support that decision.
Are you pleased in terms of our popular culture that perhaps there's been more attention in various forms of media to, say, responsible drinking, to, we've, as a society, certainly we've lifted the stigma about, not entirely by any means, but there's less of a stigma about emotional problems. But you go back even to the classic movie of the early 60s, The Days of Wine and Roses, which I think was hailed because it made the country aware that there's a serious drinking problem behind closed doors.
Yep.
Do you feel there's been progress made in general? Or?
Oh, I think there's definitely been progress. I mean, I think that, if you recall, there's changes. There's progress in terms of there's changes in our culture in the way we deal with alcohol. If you remember 20, 30 years ago, the 2 martini and 3 martini lunch was something that all business people did.
Sure.
And now kind of if you do that, kind of you're fired, because basically we need productivity to be increased and we don't want you sleeping in the afternoon.
Right.
So I think that we change, the culture shifts, and there's changes around the kinds of ways we see substances, both substances of abuse as well as substances that are supposed to help us. And those, all of those kind of change. So there's cultural shifts, I think, in doing that. I think our society has taken more seriously the consequences that you see with alcohol. We've increased our DUI laws. Mothers Against Drunk Driving have really we've got server laws. We have laws now that really kind of have tried to kind of say, wait a minute, this is a serious problem. It's no more just, oh, boys will be boys, they have to drink kinds of things. It's really, we need to kind of focus on what we need to do. So I do think that there's been some changes. I think we still have a long way to go. We don't teach our children how to drink, which is, I think, really the best way to do it. I think we teach them you're not supposed to drink until 21, and then you can do whatever you want to do. So
But
we haven't
in a moderate way where
Right.
we can learn what your capacity is and how. I would guess, even that couple of sips, you shouldn't be driving, all of those.
Yeah,
all
you
of
have to
those
really
issues, right?
learn and kind of figure out the tolerance and all the other kinds of pieces of that. I mean, my a mentor and a colleague of mine who I worked together with for a long time in the alcohol field, said there's really no problem with alcohol as long as alcohol stays a beverage. As soon as alcohol becomes a drug, it's a problem. And so if you think about, as long as it stays in the context of a social kind of drink and doing that, but when you start using it to kind of manage your anxiety or to kind of handle your social situations, or as sometimes some of the bars talk about attitude adjustment hours that they have, when you start using it that way, it becomes really problematic.
Since at the beginning, as we're closing, mentioned your two most prominent books, is there anything about Changing for Good or Addiction and Change that you'd like to mention that you haven't touched on, already, just about the experience, the process of the work that went into them?
Yeah, the Changing for Good was really a challenge because it was really translating a lot of our research into kind of helping people to kind of understand this process. And the interesting thing is, even though it's called a trans-theoretical model, that seems to be a big name, the process is actually very understandable. And as you look at the Changing for Good pieces, people have given this, therapists give this to their clients to kind of read because it really does help them understand, where am I now and what do I need to do in order to kind of move forward if I'm going to try and make this change. The other thing is what we did with Addiction and Change is we actually look at this process of people becoming addicted as well. So I'm doing some really interesting stuff with looking at adolescents here in Maryland, for example, and trying to stage them and trying to see where are they in initiating smoking, because we have access to the Maryland data. So I think that the challenge is to how to see this and how to slow down the process, because we'd like to see change happen kind of on-off switch. Today you do it, tomorrow you don't. And it's really a process. So if there's any lesson from both of those books, it's you have to be patient with the process and you have to really kind of learn how to get it all right in order to make a change happen.
Very good. Well, it's been an education for me, and I'm sure for our audience, which is whom we're really most concerned about, and a pleasure visiting with you today. Dr. Carlo DiClemente, Professor of Psychology at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm Mike Lurie from the Media Relations Office here, and thanks for visiting with us here at UMBC.